China open itself up to verification and monitoring of its greenhouse gas cuts. Now, that in itself is a perfectly reasonable demand. And in negotiation, everybody makes demands of everybody else. That's what it's all about. That's how you strike a treaty, you strike a deal. But in this case, Obama was not saying, if you do this, we will do that. We will raise our targets, we will improve our timetables, we will firm things up. That just wasn't put on the table. And then he sort of finally walks out saying, we have a deal, lands it on the rest of the world, which hadn't taken part in that deal. I think there were only 5 nations involved in these private meetings he had, and then says, sorry, must go to Washington, bad weather. And I'm afraid it's just not good enough.
It was interesting that bad weather was the reason.
Yes,
the climate was the reason for cutting short the talks.
I know. I mean, this is, the bad weather that made him fly back to Washington is nothing by comparison to what we're likely to see as a result of him flying back to Washington without a deal being done.
Well, explain that, George Monbiot, because I don't know if you're aware of how this is covered in the United States. Hardly at all. I mean, when there is extreme weather in this country, what flashes on the meteorologists' news screens, because people do tune in to weather reports all over, especially now the East Coast just blanketed in snow. Underneath, in what we call the lower third, it screams extreme weather or severe weather. Imagine if those 2 words were replaced by another 2 words, global warming. I think everyone in this country would care, because that would be most of the coverage you get on global warming in this country. But explain what you mean when you say what this could mean for the rest of the world and the United States, specifically the climate.
Well, human beings are extraordinary in that we can live in a wider range of conditions than almost any other species. But we've had this incredible good fortune over the past few thousand years, because the climate's been really kind to us, and it's enabled us to spread into almost all the regions of the world. There are very few places in which we can't live, deserts, mountaintops and oceans and the rest, but everywhere else we're pretty well filled to capacity, and these optimum climatic conditions have allowed our population to expand to about 7 billion. But a shift in global temperatures reduces the range of places in which human beings can live. For instance, during the last ice age, there was only a 4-degree temperature difference, 4 degrees centigrade, between the ice age and today, and it meant that human beings were entirely driven out of the high latitude parts of the world. Well, a shift of 2 or 4 degrees in the other direction can entirely drive human beings out of the low latitude areas of the world, simply because they dry up. There's not enough rain to support crops and to support people, and at the same time as huge regions of the world effectively become uninhabitable because the optimum conditions are no longer there, even in the temperate parts of the world, in the higher latitudes, sea level rise means that less and less land is available either for living on or for growing crops. And so we have this dreadful situation where it's very hard to see how we can sustain current levels of global food production. It's very hard to see how where many of the world's people are going to live. I mean, certainly if we're under pressure in the temperate regions, we're going to be much less inclined to let people in from regions which are becoming uninhabitable. And we have this almost perfect storm of humanitarian disaster. And you have what's called structural global famine, which means that even in a good year, you can't produce enough food for the world's people. This just casts everything else into the shade. This makes all previous disasters look like sideshows at the circus of human suffering. And yet somehow this just isn't impinging on our consciousness, and what's marked out all the negotiations and the period leading up to the negotiations is indifference and apathy. on most people's parts. There have been very few people involved in the protests. There's been very little pressure on governments, and in fact the penalty for governments for doing the right thing in taking serious action on climate change has been much graver than the penalty for doing the wrong thing, because there's just not the political mobilization that we need to see.
Well, George Monbiot of The Guardian, who are speaking to him via Democracy Now! Audio stream. We're also joined here in New York by Lucia Green-Weiskel, who just came back last night, actually on the same flight that we came back through Reykjavik, Iceland. She is with the Beijing-based Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. Lucia, you spent a lot of time with the Chinese delegation. When Hillary Clinton gave her news conference on Thursday, just before Obama came into town, clearly targeting the Chinese, talking about the lack of transparency. Explain what was happening with China through these days.
Right. Well, first, just wanted to say a little bit of background about China's position. China has been saying that these negotiations were a success, actually. The leaders have been stating that in the news. And the U.S. media has been saying that if there's anyone to blame in these negotiations, it's China, because it was resisting this transparency issue that Hillary Clinton brought up when she came to Copenhagen. But many of the big issues that China is dealing with when it comes to climate change were not discussed at all in the negotiations by anybody. China, as we know, is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, overtaking the United States just in 2006. But on a per capita basis, China is still very low in its emissions. And also, 80 to 90% of the emissions that are in the atmosphere right now were put there by the United States and Europe, not by China or by the developing world. So China has attached itself to this idea of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that language was in the Kyoto Protocol. China wanted that language to be also put into the Copenhagen Accord. And basically what that means is that because the developed world is responsible for the emissions that are in the atmosphere now, the developing world will respond to the ability that it's able. So that's a very important point that China has pursued throughout the negotiations at all levels of the Chinese delegation, but also the NGOs from China were saying that as well. So I think it's on that basis that China is saying this is a success, meaning we were able to stick to this agreement of having common but differentiated responsibilities. But that said, in the months leading up to the Copenhagen negotiation, leaders from China were saying that the United States needed to take very strong action. One of the Chinese officials said that the United States should pledge to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2020, which is obviously much higher than what Obama's pledged himself to. They also said that the United States should pledge 1% of its GDP to developing countries to help them mitigate climate change, and that hasn't happened either. So I am sure that the delegation from China also is very disappointed by Obama's commitments, or lack of commitments. I think we all thought that Obama was going to escalate his commitment. That the sort of pattern between the United States and China has been that the U.S. makes a commitment and then China will follow. Just 10 days before the negotiations, Obama announced his target, and then China came in and announced their target to reduce energy intensity by 40 to 45% of 2005 levels by 2020. So I think that China was definitely expecting more from the United States and didn't get it.
And China being blamed now in the United States for the failure of the talks, with Obama swooping in at the last minute to save it. That's very much how it's being described right now.
Right. Yeah, it's the old story of blaming China. And I think from the Chinese perspective, it's more the United States' failure, that the United States really should have led the way, and then China would have followed.
I'm interested in China has just surpassed the United States in terms of the overall carbon greenhouse gas emissions, although per capita the U.S. way exceeds China. But, for example, cars. The standards in China, I mean, we still, mainly in the United States, it's large cars. What is the trend in China now?
Well, China is just a couple of months ago, a delegation from the U.S. went to China and spoke to their counterparts in the Chinese government about China's targets and undertakings in terms of its environmental practice. And one of the things that came out of that trip was that China was talked about by U.S. politicians